Devon Cross was elbow-deep in a malfunctioning atmospheric processor when his house computer announced he had a visitor. This was unusual for three reasons. First, nobody visited his homestead without calling ahead because New Hebron was the kind of colony where neighbors lived 20 kilometers apart. Second, his security system was indicating the visitor had arrived via spacecraft, which was excessive even by frontier colony standards. Third, the computer's voice had taken on a tone he'd programmed to mean, "Something weird is happening, and you should probably pay attention." He extracted himself from the processor housing, wiped grease on his already stained coveralls, and walked back to his prefab house to find a warship parked in his front yard. Not a small shuttle or a cargo transport, but an actual military vessel with hull plating that looked like it could shrug off asteroid impacts and weapon systems that could probably vaporize his entire homestead if someone sneezed wrong. The ship bore insignia he recognized from news feeds: the Crimson Talons, elite warriors of the Vakrian Empire. Devon's first thought was that he'd somehow violated an ordinance he didn't know existed. His second thought was that he should probably change out of coveralls that smelled like hydraulic fluid and desperation. Before he could retreat inside, his door chimed. The politeness of it seemed absurd given the warship, but Devon had been raised with manners, so he answered. Standing on his doorstep was a woman who looked like every recruitment poster for legendary warriors had been merged into one person and rendered in alien perfection. She was tall, easily 6.5 feet, with a build that suggested she could break him in half without trying hard. Her features were almost human: high cheekbones, strong jaw, eyes that were startlingly amber and seemed to catalog everything about him in a single glance. The differences were subtle but unmistakable. Ridge patterns along her cheekbones that caught the light like carved gemstone, skin that had a faint iridescent quality, and those long, elegant ears that swept back from her head in a way that made his own round human ears feel inadequate. She wore ceremonial armor worked with precious metals that probably cost more than his house. Behind her, he could see armed soldiers maintaining perimeter positions around his property with professional efficiency. Devon Cross. Her voice had a resonance that made his name sound more important than it was. "That's me. If this is about unpaid taxes, I should mention that I file everything properly and 15 years ago, you saved my life." She said it like stating a fact of physics. "I have come to repay the debt." Devon blinked, then blinked again. "I think you have the wrong person. I'm pretty sure I'd remember saving someone's life, especially someone who arrives with a warship." The woman's expression remained serious, though her ears tilted forward slightly, a gesture Devon couldn't interpret. "Survey mission. Uncharted moon designated HX-247. My escape pod crashed after my ship was destroyed. You were part of the freelance exploration team that found me." Memory clicked into place with uncomfortable clarity. 15 years ago, before New Hebron, before deliberately choosing obscurity, Devon had spent 3 years doing survey work for whoever paid. There had been a crash site, a badly injured alien in damaged armor, and Devon had given her his emergency oxygen and medical kit while waiting for proper rescue. He'd left before debriefing because he'd been late for his next contract and hadn't wanted to get tangled in military procedures. "You're that person, the one in the escape pod." Devon tried to reconcile that memory of someone barely conscious with the warrior princess currently on his doorstep. "You were basically dead. I just gave you my spare oxygen. Anyone would have done the same. But they did not. You did." She straightened even further, which seemed physically impossible. "I am Commander Zhara Kelrith, Shield of the 7th Fleet, heir to the Crimson Throne of Vakria. Under the sacred law of my people, a life debt can only be repaid through the binding of honor. I offer myself in partnership to bind our lives until the debt is satisfied." Devon's brain processed this in stages. First, she was royalty. Second, she was offering marriage. Third, This was happening on his doorstep while he smelled like mechanical failure and regret. "I appreciate the offer," he said carefully, "but I really just gave you some oxygen. That doesn't seem like it needs lifelong commitment. Maybe we could call it even." Zhara's ears flattened slightly, definitely a negative response. "Among my people, equivalence must be maintained. You gave me life when you had no obligation and nothing to gain. I can only offer equivalence by binding myself to you, as I cannot serve below my station as heir to the throne. This is not negotiable." Behind her, Devon noticed his neighbor's agricultural drone hovering nearby, undoubtedly recording everything. By tomorrow, this would be all over the colony networks. By next week, probably interstellar news. "Can we maybe discuss this inside?" Devon asked, "before my entire life becomes a public spectacle." Zhara inclined her head gracefully. "Of course, I apologize for the abrupt intrusion." She stepped into his modest prefab house, and Devon watched a legendary warrior princess examine his small kitchen, his second-hand furniture, his half-eaten sandwich still sitting on the counter. He designed this life to be deliberately unremarkable, a place to hide from complications. Apparently, complications had found him anyway. The governor of New Hebron looked like someone had explained a problem to her using only interpretive dance and screaming. Her name was Helena Voss, and in the 3 years Devon had lived here, he'd seen her handle atmospheric crises, crop failures, and one memorable incident involving illegally imported livestock with calm competence. Right now, she looked like she was reconsidering every life choice that had led to this moment. "Let me make sure I understand," Voss said, pacing Devon's small living room while Zhara sat calmly on his second-hand couch. "Your Commander Zhara Kelrith. The Commander Zhara Kelrith, Shield of the 7th Fleet, the woman who led the defense of Corvash Station against impossible odds, the warrior who single-handedly held the breach at Talvin for 3 days until reinforcements arrived. That Commander Zhara Kelrith." "I had help at Talvin," Zhara said modestly. "It was closer to 2.5 days. And you're here because Devon gave you oxygen 15 years ago. He saved my life. So now you want to marry him. I want to bind our lives together to honor the debt, yes." Voss turned to Devon, who was making tea because he had no idea what else to do. "And you, what do you want?" "I want to understand how giving someone oxygen becomes a marriage proposal," Devon said, setting out mugs. "I've been helpful before. I once helped my neighbor fix his irrigation system. He didn't propose." "Your neighbor is not Vakrian royalty bound by sacred tradition." Zhara accepted the tea with a nod of thanks. "This is good tea. It's the cheap stuff from the supply station. Then I look forward to trying the expensive version." A human diplomatic corps shuttle had arrived an hour after the governor, and now Devon's house was full of officials who all seemed to agree on one thing. He needed to refuse Zhara's claim immediately. A woman with too many credentials and not enough sleep had spent 20 minutes explaining why accepting would destabilize human-Vakrian relations. "Commander Kelrith is betrothed to Lord Vrakar of the Silver Houses," the diplomat explained. "That marriage is supposed to cement a critical alliance between two major Vakrian factions. If she binds herself to you instead, it creates a succession crisis that could affect our standing treaties. So my choices are marry an alien warrior princess or accidentally cause an interstellar incident?" Devon asked. "Essentially, yes. Those are terrible choices. Welcome to diplomacy." Zhara set down her tea with careful precision. "There is a third option. If Devon refuses the binding, he publicly declares my life worthless. By Vakrian law, this requires me to either challenge him to combat, which would kill him as he has no training, or commit ritual suicide to restore my family's honor." The room went very quiet. "You're saying if I say no you die?" Devon asked. "Or you die, but yes, one of those outcomes. That seems like an extreme cultural practice." "We are an extreme people," Zhara's ears tilted forward. Also, I should mention that 7 assassination attempts have been made on your life in the past 4 hours. My security detail has neutralized them all. Devon walked to his window and saw what he'd mistaken for landscaping equipment was actually Vakrian soldiers in active camouflage, scattered across his property in defensive positions. His garden, the one part of his simple life he was genuinely proud of, was absolutely ruined. "Who's trying to kill me?" he asked, with the calm of someone whose life had become too absurd to process normally. "Agents of the Silver Houses, most likely," Zhara said. "Vrakar's family would prefer you dead before the binding can be formalized. Also possibly agents of the Crimson Court who view a human binding as an unacceptable dilution of royal bloodlines. The assassination methods have been varied enough to suggest multiple interested parties." The lead diplomat offered Devon a sympathetic look. "We can offer you protective custody off-world. Full relocation, new identity support until this resolves. If he flees, he honors the debt while dishonoring me," Zhara interjected. "Same outcome. I lose my rank, my succession claim, and likely my life to rivals who see weakness." "So I'm trapped," Devon said. "I either marry you, cause your death, or cause your death slightly differently. I prefer to think of it as an opportunity for cross-cultural partnership," Zhara said, refilling her tea with the composure of someone discussing weather patterns. "Also, your kitchen is well organized. I appreciate efficiency." Devon sat down heavily on his remaining chair, the good one that didn't wobble. "This is insane. A week ago, my biggest problem was a faulty CO2 scrubber." "Life is full of surprises," Zhara observed. "For what it's worth, I did not plan this to be coercive. When I discovered you had relocated to a frontier colony, I assumed you valued privacy. I intended to present my case respectfully and allow you time to consider." "What changed?" "Lord Vrakar learned of my intentions. He accelerated his timeline, which forced me to accelerate mine." She met his eyes directly, and Devon saw something beyond the legendary warrior, genuine concern, maybe even regret. "I am sorry your life has been disrupted, but the debt is real and my honor demands I repay it. I cannot walk away from this, even if I wish to." The diplomatic team continued debating options, but Devon stopped listening. He looked at Zhara, beautiful, deadly, absurdly powerful, sitting in his cheap kitchen drinking mediocre tea, and apologizing for turning his life upside down because he'd once been kind to a stranger. "If I agree to this," Devon said slowly, "what happens?" "We formalize the binding through ceremony. You become my partner under Vakrian law, which grants you certain protections and status. Your life becomes more complicated." "More complicated than 7 assassination attempts in 4 hours. "Potentially, yes." Devon laughed because the alternative was screaming. "This is the worst thank you I've ever received." "I know," Zhara said softly, and her ears drooped in what was definitely an apologetic gesture. "If there were another way, I would take it. But this is the path honor demands, and honor is all I have." Outside, new Hebron's dual suns were setting, painting the sky in colors Earth never produced. Devon's simple house, his deliberately unremarkable life, had become the center of an interstellar political crisis, because 15 years ago he'd made the basic decision to help someone in need. "I need time to think," he said finally. "Of course." Zhara stood with warrior grace. "My ship and security detail will maintain perimeter. We will ensure no further attempts on your life succeed while you consider." "How reassuring." "I do what I can." She paused at the door, and for a moment the legendary commander looked uncertain. "For what it's worth, Devon Cross, you seem like a good person. I hope my debt does not destroy that." Then she was gone, leaving Devon alone with diplomatic officials, impossible choices, and the growing certainty that his quiet life was over whether he agreed to this or not. Fixing atmospheric processors while accompanied by an alien warrior princess turned out to be surprisingly normal after the first day of absolute weirdness. Zhara insisted on understanding Devon's daily routine, something about proper binding requiring mutual knowledge of life patterns, which meant she now handed him tools while he repaired filtration systems and explained why the settlers of New Hebron kept accidentally programming their Co-2 scrubbers backward. It's because the interface defaults to Earth standard, Devon explained, elbow-deep in a recalibration panel. But New Hebron's atmosphere has different composition ratios. People forget to adjust for local conditions, and then wonder why their houses smell like dying. Attention to environmental detail is critical for survival, Zhara observed, passing him the molecular scanner he'd been reaching for without him asking. My people learned this lesson early in our expansion. Entire colonies were lost to atmospheric miscalculation. That's significantly more dramatic than accidentally setting your scrubber wrong. Death by asphyxiation is death by asphyxiation, regardless of scale. They'd fallen into this pattern over 3 days, Devon maintaining his work schedule while Zhara accompanied him with a security detail that made his maintenance calls look like military operations. The settlers of New Hebron had adjusted to the situation with the practical flexibility of people who'd chosen to live on a frontier world in the first place. Most seemed more interested in getting their equipment fixed than why Devon now traveled with legendary alien warriors. Mrs. Chen at the Eastern Settlement even offered Zhara homemade preserves, which the commander accepted with such earnest gratitude that Devon suspected she'd never been offered preserves before. During the quiet moments between service calls, Devon learned things about Zhara that didn't match her legendary reputation. She was terrible at human card games but excellent at strategic analysis. She found Earth jokes confusing but tried to understand them anyway. She'd been fighting since she was barely adult by Vakrian standards, shaped into a weapon and symbol before she'd had a chance to be anything else. The arranged marriage to Vrakar, Devon said as they drove to the next maintenance call. Why didn't you just refuse it? Vakrian nobility cannot refuse family obligations without cause. Zhara watched the landscape pass, New Hebron's strange purple vegetation and distant mountains. Marriage alliances maintain stability between houses. Refusing would suggest I value personal desire over family duty. But a sacred debt is acceptable cause. A sacred debt supersedes family. Governor Voss delivered the news personally, her expression grim. Vakrian law gives you 3 options. Accept the challenge, refuse and forfeit all claims, or, she glanced at Zhara, have Commander Kelrith fight as your champion. I cannot fight as his champion, Zhara said immediately. Doing so declares him incapable of defending his own honor, which invalidates the binding. The debt can only be repaid to someone I deem worthy of equivalence. So I have to fight a professional warrior myself, Devon asked, or refuse and walk away, Voss said, which results in Zhara losing everything. Yes. Devon looked at his hands, calloused from maintenance work, scarred from small injuries, utterly unprepared for combat against alien nobility. How long do I have? 7 days until the trial, Zhara said quietly. Devon, you do not have to do this. I will accept the consequences of your refusal. I will not force you into death to satisfy my honor. What happens if I refuse? I return to the arranged marriage. My autonomy ends, but I survive. And if I fight and lose? You die, I return to the arranged marriage. The outcome is the same for me. Devon stood in the New Hebron sunshine, surrounded by purple vegetation and the simple homestead he'd been trying to repair, and realized that walking away meant both of them stayed trapped. Fighting meant at least one of them had a chance at something different. Teach me, he said. You've got 7 days. Teach me how to not die immediately. Zhara's ears shot forward in surprise. Devon, I'm not saying I can win. I'm saying maybe I can last long enough to prove a point, that I'm willing to try. Isn't that what honor is about, trying even when it's stupid? For the first time since arriving, Zhara smiled. genuine and unguarded, like someone who'd been holding their breath finally exhaling. Vakrian tradition states that if you survive 5 minutes in trial combat without yielding, you satisfy honor requirements even in loss. I can teach you to survive 5 minutes. That's a terrible plan. It is the only plan that ends with you alive and me free. Then I guess we're doing terrible plans now. That evening, in the cleared space behind Devon's house, he began learning how to fight from the galaxy's most feared warrior. It was humiliating, exhausting, and revealed muscles he didn't know he had. But watching Zhara patiently correct his stance, encouraging him when he improved, laughing when he made mistakes, Devon realized he didn't want her to leave. Not because of sacred debts or political implications, but because in 3 days she'd made his deliberately simple life feel less like hiding and more like living. Training to not die against an alien warrior, Lord turned out to be exactly as awful as Devon expected. Zhara woke him before dawn each day for conditioning, drilled him in basic defensive techniques until his body screamed, and patiently explained that no, he could not win, but yes, he could maybe survive long enough to satisfy honor. Vakar will toy with you, she explained on the 4th day, demonstrating a grappling technique that left Devon face down in New Hebron's purple grass. He wants to prove your unworthiness through humiliation, not quick death. Use that. Make him work for every strike. Fall down, get up, refuse to quit. That's your entire strategy. Be stubborn. You are human. Stubbornness is your species' greatest asset. She helped him to his feet with surprising gentleness. Also, you are learning faster than expected. Your survival instincts are excellent. My survival instincts are screaming at me to run away. Yet you are still here. Zhara's ears tilted forward approval. Devon had learned. That is courage. The nights were strange interludes in the chaos. Zhara couldn't return to her ship without appearing to doubt Devon's commitment, so she stayed in his modest house, sleeping on his couch with the same composure she brought to everything else. They'd fall into conversations after training, Devon cooking simple meals, while Zhara told stories about battles that sounded more like myths, asking questions about Earth culture and human history with genuine curiosity. Your species nearly destroyed itself multiple times, she observed on the 5th night, yet you survived through cooperation. My people conquered our challenges through strength. I wonder which approach is more sustainable. Maybe both, Devon said, serving the closest thing to Vakrian cuisine he could manage with New Hebron's limited ingredients. Strength to face challenges, cooperation to make sure you don't face them alone. Is that why you saved me? Cooperation instinct. I saved you because you were dying and I could help. It wasn't complicated. Yet it changed both our lives. On the 6th night, the closest assassination attempt yet bypassed security. A microdrone loaded with neurotoxins slipped through perimeter defenses during a shift change and made it into Devon's bedroom. Zhara intercepted it with reflexes that didn't look possible, destroying the drone with her bare hand before it could deliver its payload. But she took a glancing exposure, enough toxin to leave her weakened and fighting its effects. Devon spent the night keeping her conscious, using the same basic first aid that had saved her 15 years ago, keeping her talking, monitoring her breathing, using techniques that were primitive by Vakrian medical standards, but effective enough until her ship's medical team arrived. He sat beside her on his cheap couch, watching a legendary warrior struggle against poison while her soldiers scrambled to synthesize a counteragent, and realized with uncomfortable clarity that he didn't want her to leave. Not because of the binding or politics or any of the complicated galactic implications, but because in 6 days she'd made his deliberately simple life feel less like hiding and more like actually living. She'd listened to his stories about fixing heir processors like they mattered. She'd tried his terrible cooking and complimented it anyway. She treated his modest house not as a disappointment compared to royal palaces, but as something worth understanding because it was his. You should have let it hit me, Zhara said, her voice weak but steady. If I die from assassination, you are released from obligation without dishonor. That's a terrible backup plan. It is practical. It's stupid. Devon checked her pulse, elevated but stabilizing. You came here to repay a debt because I saved your life. Letting you die now would make that whole thing pointless. You did not ask for this complication. No, but I'm stuck with it now. So you're going to survive. I'm going to not die tomorrow against your ex-fiancé, and we're both going to figure out what happens next. Zhara managed a weak smile, her ears twitching with what might have been amusement or might have been toxin-induced delirium. You are very stubborn. You mentioned that. It is. She paused, searching for words attractive in humans. This refusal to accept impossible situations. Are you flirting with me while poisoned? I am making observations while cognitively impaired. There is a difference. The medical team arrived with counteragents, and Zhara was stabilized within the hour. But something had shifted between them, an acknowledgement that this had stopped being just about sacred debts and political necessities somewhere along the way. The trial by combat was scheduled for dawn on New Hebron's main landing field, cleared and prepared with Vakrian ceremonial precision. Media crews from a dozen species had set up observation positions, and Devon could see the feeds already running. Human engineer faces Vakrian lord in impossible combat, and cross-species binding trial captivates galaxy. Lord Vakar arrived with appropriate dramatic flair. A full ceremonial procession, honor guards in gleaming armor, and the Lord himself looking like someone had designed the perfect killing machine and given it noble bearing. He was taller than Zhara, broader, covered in the ritual scars of someone who'd fought and won more battles than Devon had lived years. His armor was worked with precious metals and achievements, and the weapons he carried looked capable of cutting through starship hulls. Devon, wearing protective gear that Zhara's soldiers had hastily fabricated to fit his human frame, felt like he was about to fight a natural disaster. You have been given the opportunity to withdraw, Vakar announced in formal Vakrian, his voice amplified across the field. The translation software rendered it in Devon's earpiece. Acknowledge your unworthiness and depart with your life. Commander Kelrith will return to fulfill her proper obligations. Devon looked at Zhara, standing at the edge of the combat circle in full ceremonial armor. Her expression carefully neutral, but her ears tilted forward in what he'd learned was encouragement. Behind her, Governor Voss and the human diplomatic team watched with expressions ranging from concern to resignation. Further back, Vakrian nobles from multiple houses observed with the cold calculation of people evaluating political opportunities. I'm not withdrawing, Devon said, his voice surprisingly steady. I accept the challenge. The crowd murmured, surprise, excitement, some species equivalent of both. Vakar's expression didn't change, but Devon saw disappointment flicker across his features. The Lord had expected Devon to run. The combat began with ceremonial formality, acknowledgments, ritual phrases, the invocation of ancient traditions. Then Vakar moved, and Devon discovered that all of Zhara's training had barely prepared him for how fast a Vakrian warrior could strike. The first blow came like a freight train, and Devon barely managed the defensive position Zhara had drilled into him, redirecting rather than blocking. The impact still sent him stumbling, and he realized with crystal clarity that 5 minutes was going to feel like an eternity. Vakar pressed the advantage, delivering strikes meant to intimidate rather than kill, proving the point that a human maintenance engineer had no business binding with Vakrian royalty. Devon kept moving, using every desperate technique Zhara had taught him, not trying to win but trying to survive. Fall down, get up, refuse to quit. At 2 minutes, Devon took a strike to his ribs that cracked something and left him gasping. At 3 minutes, a blow to his shoulder sent his weapon spinning away. At 4 minutes and 30 seconds, Vakar delivered a combination that should have ended things. a strike pattern designed to force submission through overwhelming superiority. Devon, desperate and running on pure stubborn refusal to die, remembered something Zhara had mentioned during training. Vakrian combat doctrine prioritized power over deception. They fought with honor, which meant they sometimes forgot that weaker opponents might not. So instead of trying to block or dodge, Devon did something stupid. He dropped low, inside Vrakar's guard where the larger warrior's reach became a disadvantage, and struck upward with the small backup blade Zhara had insisted he carry. It was a clumsy, graceless move that any trained warrior would have countered easily. But Vrakar, expecting another defensive scramble, didn't counter. The blade caught him along the forearm, barely a scratch, not even enough to slow him down, but enough to draw first blood. The combat arena went absolutely silent. In Vakrian trial law, first blood drawn by the weaker combatant was recognized as exceptional valor. It didn't mean Devon had won. Vrakar could still kill him easily, could continue the combat until Devon yielded or died. But it satisfied the honor requirement in a way that exceeded all expectations. Vrakar stared at the small cut on his arm, then at Devon, who was on his knees gasping for breath with at least one cracked rib and a shoulder that felt like it was on fire. The Vakrian lord's expression cycled through surprise, reassessment, and finally something that might have been respect. "You drew first blood," Vrakar said, his voice carrying across the silent field. "Using technique unbefitting a warrior, but effective nonetheless." "I'm not a warrior," Devon managed between gasps. "I'm an engineer who fixes air processors, but I'm willing to bleed for someone who matters." Vrakar looked at Zhara, who had moved forward to the edge of the combat circle, her expression carefully controlled but her ears forward in obvious pride. Then back to Devon, still kneeling in the dust of New Hebron's landing field. "You satisfy the requirement of valor," Vrakar announced formally. "Not through skill, but through demonstrated principle, the willingness to face certain defeat for another's sake. It is the same quality you showed 15 years ago, and it is worthy of recognition." He turned to address the assembled observers. "I withdraw my challenge. Devon Cross of Earth is worthy of the binding with Commander Zhara Kelrith. Let no house contest this judgment." The crowd erupted, some in approval, others in protest, most in shock that the combat had ended this way. Devon barely processed it. He was too focused on breathing through broken ribs and not passing out from pain. Then Zhara was beside him, supporting him with surprising gentleness, her expression a mix of relief and something softer. "You magnificent fool," she said quietly. "You actually drew first blood against a Vakrian combat lord. Was that good?" "It was impossible, which makes it very, very good." The formalization ceremony happened 3 days later, giving Devon time to heal and both civilizations time to adjust to the new reality. The event was half human tradition, half Vakrian ritual, and entirely surreal. Devon stood in formal attire that human diplomatic corps had rushed to New Hebron, beside Zhara in ceremonial robes that made her look like she'd stepped out of ancient legends, in front of witnesses from across the galaxy. The vows were simple but profound, promises of partnership, mutual protection, shared life. When it was done, Devon wore a small crystal pendant that marked him as bonded to Vakrian royalty, and Zhara wore a plain metal band that Devon had made himself in his workshop, not because he couldn't afford better, but because he'd wanted to give her something he'd created rather than purchased. The political fallout was immediate and complex. Vakrian houses scrambled to adjust their alliances. Human diplomatic corps debated what Devon's new status meant for human-Vakrian relations, and media across multiple species analyzed every aspect of what they were calling the New Hebron binding. Treaties were re-examined, precedents were set, and somewhere in the bureaucratic machinery of multiple governments, people frantically updated protocols for cross-species diplomatic marriages. But inside Devon's modest house, now equipped with diplomatic-grade security, Vakrian communication systems, and an odd mix of human engineering equipment and alien ceremonial artifacts. Two people who'd both been running from expectations found unexpected peace. Zhara maintained her military rank, but chose to base herself on New Hebron rather than in the Imperial Corps, becoming an unofficial ambassador while continuing her duties remotely. Devon went back to fixing atmospheric processors, now with a legendary warrior wife who accompanied him on service calls, and had finally learned to make decent tea. The settlers of New Hebron adjusted with characteristic frontier flexibility. Mrs. Chen still offered preserves. The eastern settlement still had problems with their Co-2 scrubbers. Life continued, just with more security patrols and the occasional diplomatic shuttle landing. 2 months after the binding, Devon and Zhara sat on his porch watching New Hebron's dual sunset, a daily ritual they'd fallen into. Somewhere in orbit, diplomatic ships continued negotiating the implications of their bond. In the house behind them, dinner was cooking, and tomorrow Devon had 3 maintenance calls scheduled. "You know," Devon said, breaking the comfortable silence, 15 years ago, if someone told me giving away my spare oxygen would result in marrying an alien warrior princess, I probably would have kept the oxygen." Zhara's ears tilted in amusement. "And miss all this excitement. I came to New Hebron specifically to avoid excitement. How is that working out for you?" Devon looked at the security perimeter that now surrounded his property, the diplomatic shuttle parked beside his workshop, the media drones that occasionally tried to breach the no-fly zone, and finally at Zhara. Beautiful, deadly, legendary, and somehow exactly where both of them needed to be. She traded royal palaces for a prefab house on a frontier colony. He traded deliberate obscurity for being the center of interstellar attention. "Terribly," he admitted. "My quiet life is completely ruined. My garden was destroyed by your security forces. I can't go anywhere without armed escorts. I'm married to someone who could kill me with her pinky finger, and I still don't fully understand half the political implications of what we did. Should I apologize again?" "No." Devon reached over and took her hand, the same hand that had destroyed an assassination drone, that had trained him for combat, that wore his handmade wedding band. "Because I'm starting to think terrible might be better than I gave it credit for. Being safe and hidden was comfortable, but it wasn't really living. This," he gestured at the chaos their life had become, "is complicated and dangerous and completely absurd. But it's real, and I think I prefer real." Zhara's expression softened, her ears tilting forward in that way he'd learned meant genuine affection. "For someone who fixes air processors, you are surprisingly wise. I have good teachers. Mostly you. Also Mrs. Chen, who gave me advice about marriage that I'm pretty sure applies cross-species. Which was, every relationship is work, dear. The good ones are just work worth doing. Mrs. Chen is wise. Mrs. Chen makes excellent preserves and has been married for 40 years. I'm taking all her advice." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun set, and New Hebron's strange nocturnal insects began their evening songs, sounds Earth never produced, on a world Devon had chosen for its distance from everything complicated. Fate or sacred debt or simple kindness from 15 years ago had brought that complication directly to his doorstep. "Do you regret it?" Zhara asked quietly. "Everything that's changed." Devon